Welcome to the 5-Minute Guide 2014 intro about Outcasts, about Oliver Twist and Army Poems, created by Rohit Nair. Before we start, I'm going to make a quick review about Perrin and Swift. Created the new versus historical criticism. New criticism is basically what you read in the book and how you interpret it. And historical criticism is like going back into the history of the author and the conflicts during that time period. So about new criticism of Oliver Twist. Basically, this story is about a young boy who's basically in an orphanage and is struggling to make ends meet. Being alone, his birth itself is very quite separated from the normal. And basically, the whole point of the story is him trying to find a family and how to find true love. I guess you could say Oliver Twist fits the stereotypical outcast because he's always by himself in an orphanage. He's lost his family at a young age and is always trying to look for acceptance. However, historical criticism, basically the entire story revolves around Charles Dickens, is the inspiration for the character Oliver Twist, who's basically Charles Dickens' childhood basically represents what Oliver Twist experienced. Charles Dickens had a rough life. His father was a drunk and went to jail at a young age, and his mother was not able to support his family. So he had to start working at a shoe factory at a young age, and basically it was like the old-time factories with all the machines and very dangerous for little kids. This is a time where he experienced orphanage because he had to live at the factory during this time. And this is where he could feel the dark social caste compared to the middle class. And oftentimes, as he got older, he started to see, since he was also a journalist, he began to see the dark social classes and how oftentimes they were often ignored by everyone. So this is basically the start of how he created Oliver Twist, the character itself. Another part is the history during this time period. 19th century passed the English Poor Laws, which is basically just so that poor people could also be accepted into many jobs and such. But basically that obviously did not work really well, and poor people started to face the harsh reality of jobs and oftentimes would kill themselves than rather do the hard work needed. As you move on to now the army poems, about an army crops on the march. The interesting thing about that is basically both these authors, in fact, of both poems lived through the Civil War when it began and ended. And for an army crops on the march, the important thing to know is that basically it's not really much historical criticism, because since the author is just basically describing the army getting tired and the weapons and the army itself, and basically it's just describing in real time how the people were also struggling and weary of that time and often thought about whether they should live or die. And for Night March, the most important thing to take away from it is that it's not even about the war itself. It's basically just creating a bit sort of philosophy to add on to the story. At the end, it brings a sort of, is there a God out there sort of thing. So you could relate this to how the people back then were starting to doubt the belief of God. And as we continue on to new criticism, an army corps on the march. Again, we bring it up. Basically, as the title itself would say, is basically about an army marching and how much weary it is. And Night March is, like I said before, not even about the war itself, but mainly brings in the continuation of the stars and, like I said before, the introduction of is there a God out there. To wrap up my final thoughts, I would like to first bring up two main important points. The first one is about new criticism and historical criticism. The main thing we need to take out of both of these is that they're both very important ways to evaluate a story. The new criticism, like I said in the beginning of this video, is basically how we as the reader evaluate the book and how we see it as ourselves. And basically, historical criticism is looking at the relevance of the novel during the time period of the author and the background. And another important thing is how both these authors used Outcasts as a key factor into the corporation of their novels. As you can see, Oliver Twist used his outcast. Charles Dickens used his outcast as a form of inspiration for the people, creating a happy ending towards the novel. And the Army Corps on the March story used the outcast as a sort of the army itself, being completely isolated from the battlefield. And Night March was another sort of outcast used by the people on how we are so far away from the stars and the gods itself.